Imagine a room so tense that one quiet response from a former leader doesn't just silence his loudest critic, it rewrites the entire narrative of the day. But before that single sentence landed, the atmosphere was a powder keg just waiting for a match. The Washington press briefing room felt electric, charged with the kind of anticipation that comes right before a storm. Journalists were pressed shoulder to shoulder, pens poised, cameras angled like predators. Everyone sensed the shift could come from a single phrase. And when the current president stepped to the podium, his eyes scanning for a target, they knew it would. He found his mark, and the insult he delivered was designed to humiliate. Leaning into the microphone, his voice sharpened to a point. 8 years of elegant speeches, he declared. But when you scrape away the polish, you find nothing of substance left behind. The words didn't just drop, they detonated. A ripple of shock moved through the crowd. Whispers broke out. Some smirks appeared, eager for the conflict. Every eye, every lens swiveled to the side of the room. Because the target of the jab wasn't watching on a screen. He was sitting right there. The former president had come for a dialogue on policy, not a spectacle. He sat perfectly composed, a picture of stillness amidst the growing chaos. For his rival, that presence was an irresistible provocation, a golden chance to dominate the headlines. He trades in platitudes. The president continued, his voice rising. The media adored his poetry, but poetry doesn't secure borders or fill paychecks. With every sentence, he hammered the podium, feeding on the reactive energy. Across the room, the only movement was a slight, deliberate adjustment of a cufflink. A subtle shift that spoke volumes. A veteran correspondent leaned to her colleague and whispered, "If he answers, it changes everything." The room held its breath. The contrast was now the real story. One man, a whirlwind of gesture and accusation. The other, an island of unnerving calm. The president pointed directly now. There's the master orator himself. All talk, no tangible results. The people are exhausted by it. The challenge hung in the air, thick and heavy. Would the calm break? Or was the silence itself the answer? Then he moved, not with haste, but with a deliberate, grounded certainty. He pushed back his chair, the sound a stark scrape in the quiet, and rose to his full height. The very act of standing pulled the room's gravity toward him. He walked to the spare microphone at the side, his pace measured, utterly unconcerned with rushing. He adjusted the stand, and then he paused. He let the silence build, stretch, and become its own form of power. In that suspended moment, who truly controlled the room? Reporters froze, pens hovering. The president's confident smirk remained, but it didn't reach his eyes anymore. The former leader finally scanned the crowd, his gaze connecting with individuals, with cameras, with the nation beyond. When he spoke, his voice was like a low, clear river. This discussion was never about me. It's about the future we are all tasked with building. It wasn't the viral line yet, but it was the first move in a strategic reply. The president snorted. See? Always pivoting to vague ideals. People need concrete actions, not more philosophy. But the philosophy that followed would cut to the core. The former president didn't raise his voice. He simply tilted his head, like a teacher considering a familiar refrain. Action without a moral compass, he said, is just motion. And motion without direction is noise. The line landed with surgical precision. A few reporters exhaled sharply. The president fired back. We have direction. Record markets, reclaimed jobs, national pride restored. The calm figure responded, his tone almost gentle. Pride isn't a statistic. Pride is the dignity we afford one another in our daily discourse. You could feel the energy tilting perceptibly. With each exchange, a quiet truth was becoming undeniable. It became a chess match of ethos. Aggressive, personal attacks met with principled, broad reframes. You left this nation fractured. Division isn't born from the populace. It's seeded by those who lead. I rebuilt its strength. Strength absent wisdom is merely a costume, and it frays when tested. The journalist's notes were now filling up with the calm man's phrases. The headline was transforming in real time. The president, sensing the narrative slip, escalated. And in doing so, he created the perfect opening. His gestures grew wilder. His tone turned into a blade. You had your moment. History remembers your empty promises, your weakness. The former president listened, unblinking. Then he leaned in, his voice gaining a new, grounded weight. A mistake isn't defined by a stumble, he said. It's defined by refusing to extend a hand to those who stumbled with you. The room drew a collective breath. It was a warning. The final, decisive blow was being prepared. Frustration boiled over. One insult, too personal, too crude, was unleashed. You weren't just ineffective, the president spat, his voice raw. Your entire tenure was a historical error this country is still correcting. A genuine gasp echoed through the room. Pens clattered to desks. It was a line meant to obliterate. And in response, the former president did something extraordinary. He didn't flinch. He buttoned his suit jacket with one slow, deliberate motion and stepped forward. The click of his shoes on the floor was the only sound. He arrived at the microphone, placed his hands flat on the surface, and looked directly at his adversary. And in that look was a universe of judgment. He let the silence compound the tension until it was almost unbearable. Then, in a tone that was clear, firm, and carried to every corner without strain, he delivered the line that would define the encounter. Leadership isn't demonstrated by who you can diminish, he said. It's proven by who you have the capacity to elevate. For a full 3 seconds, there was perfect dead quiet. No keyboards, no whispers, just the echo of those words, rewriting reality. In that silence, the fight was over. Who had really won? The president opened his mouth, but no retort came. He simply stood there, knuckles white on the podium, his earlier bravado evaporating. The former president had already pivoted, his gaze returning to the cameras, to the people. That's the purpose of our gathering today, he said, to focus on the next generation. They will be the judges of what true service looks like. The press corps erupted into frantic scribbling. The story was now incontrovertibly his. The attempt to reclaim the stage was pathetic, a sputter against a settled truth. More pretty words, the president muttered, but it was a feeble echo. Every subsequent question from the journalist was directed at the meaning of that one defining sentence. The former president expanded, his composure unshakable. A leader's legacy, he said, isn't measured by the opponents he demolishes. It's measured by the citizens he empowers to build. Each statement was another nail in the coffin of the earlier theatrics. The camera loved the contrast, serene authority against flustered defiance. But the power of that moment didn't live in its immediate silence. It lived in the hours, days, and weeks that followed. It lived in the breakdowns on cable news, the water cooler conversations in offices from New York to Los Angeles, and the textbooks where it would one day be analyzed as a masterstroke of public discourse. To truly understand its seismic impact, we have to rewind beyond the initial insult to the very foundations of this clash. It was never merely personal. It was a collision of worldviews, decades in the making. Long before they stood in that briefing room, their paths represented two distinct philosophies of American power. One believed strength was a show, a blunt force display meant to cow opponents and thrill supporters. He saw every interaction as a transaction, a zero-sum game where a victory for one meant a loss for another. His language was deliberately simple, built on repetition and absolutes, designed to tap into primal emotions of pride and grievance. For him, leadership was a performance art of domination. The other came from a different tradition. His intellectual foundation was rooted in the slow, steady work of building consensus. He viewed power not as a cudgel, but as a responsibility, a tool to be wielded with precision, calibrated to uplift systems and institutions. His rhetoric was complex, layered with historical allusion and appeals to common purpose. His calm wasn't an absence of passion. It was the product of intense discipline. He believed that to move a nation, you first had to appeal to its better angels, not its basest fears. This was the deeper battle being fought under the bright lights of the press room. Every word from the podium was an attack on the very idea that intellect and restraint had a place in leadership. And every measured response from the audience was a defense of it. The tension in the air wasn't just about two men. It was a proxy war for the nation's soul. When the president bellowed about results, he meant economic indicators and military posturing. When the former president countered with pride is dignity, he spoke to the invisible fabric of society, the mutual respect that holds a diverse democracy together. Now, let's pull back into that silent room, just after the defining line has landed. The shockwave is still traveling. For the reporters, it was as if the air pressure had suddenly changed. A young journalist from an online publication felt his hands trembling slightly as he typed the quote into his laptop, knowing it was the centerpiece of his piece. An older photographer, who'd covered conflicts and rallies for 30 years, lowered his camera for a moment. He'd seen shouting matches before, but this quiet, surgical dismantling of a bully was something new. He knew he'd just captured a historic frame. The deflated aggressor, mouth slightly agape, and the serene victor, already turning his focus elsewhere. The president, in the void left by his opponent's words, scrambled. His mind, trained for rapid counterattack, searched for a familiar insult, a statistic to cite, a rallying cry. But nothing felt big enough. The attack he had leveled was massive, personal, and final. The response he received wasn't a denial, wasn't a counter-accusation. It was a complete reframing of the contest itself. How do you attack someone who just declared they won't be playing the game of attack anymore? How do you shout down someone whose power is sourced from their refusal to shout? He tried. Real leaders deliver. He finally managed, his voice lacking its earlier bluster. They don't stand around giving lectures on morality. It was weak, and the room knew it. The words evaporated before they reached the back row. The former president, sensing the vacuum, didn't press the attack. He did something far more devastating. He expanded the idea. He made it universal. Today, he continued, his voice still even, we came to discuss education. Because real results aren't just a quarterly report. They're a child who can read. They're a young adult who can think critically. They're a citizen who can participate in this great experiment with knowledge and empathy. That is the elevation we must strive for. That is the building no insult can ever tear down. He was no longer just defending himself. He was teaching. He was demonstrating the very principle he had just articulated. By pivoting to policy, he elevated the conversation from the mud of personal grievance to the high ground of public purpose. The journalist's questions shifted immediately. Sir, how do we rebuild that civic empathy? Can you elaborate on the link between education and national strength? The president at the podium became a spectator at his own event. His aides in the back exchanged worried glances. The narrative hadn't just shifted. It had been captured and taken to a higher elevation, leaving their man stranded on a lonely, barren hill of spite. This moment also revealed a crucial truth about modern media. The spectacle of anger, the dramatic insult, is easy to capture. It's a bright, hot flame that demands attention. But this new moment proved that a quieter, colder truth could be even more compelling. It was shareable not because it was outrageous, but because it was profound. On social media, the clip of the calm reply would be viewed millions more times than the clip of the initial rant. Why? Because outrage is a cheap, fleeting emotion. Inspiration, however, is a rare and valuable commodity. People didn't just watch the reply. They absorbed it. They replayed it. They sent it to friends with captions like, "This is how you do it," or "Remember this next time someone tries to get under your skin." Furthermore, the exchange became a case study in the psychology of persuasion. The aggressor strategy was based on a principle psychologists call emotion contagion. He was trying to infect the room and the viewing public with his anger and disdain. He wanted people to feel his grievance, so they would adopt his position. The respondent strategy was based on cognitive reframing. He did not accept the premise of the fight. He changed the frame from who is stronger to what is strength for. By doing so, he inoculated the audience against the emotional contagion and invited them into a more reasoned, values-based evaluation. It was a Jedi mind trick played on a global stage. As the event drew to a close, the body language told the final chapter. The president gathered his papers with stiff, jerky movements, his shoulders hunched as if against a cold wind that only he could feel. He exited quickly, surrounded by a phalanx of staff, offering no further comment. The former president, however, remained. He lingered, shaking hands with lawmakers, exchanging a few quiet words with some of the veteran journalists. He was in no hurry. He owned the space now, and he knew it. His departure was slow, deliberate, a final demonstration of the control he had exerted, not through force, but through unshakable presence. In the days that followed, the analysis would pour in. Pundits would call it the most effective political mic drop of the decade. Communication coaches would dissect the sentence structure, the pause, the eye contact. But for the average person watching at home, the lesson was simpler and more personal. They saw that you don't have to scream to be heard. They saw that dignity can be an armor. They saw that when someone tries to drag you into the mud, you don't have to go. You can simply point to the higher ground and invite everyone else to join you there. Let's pause for a second and consider the actual anatomy of that single, perfect sentence. Leadership isn't demonstrated by who you can diminish. It's proven by who you have the capacity to elevate. It worked because it operated on multiple levels at once. On the surface, it was a direct, principled rebuke of the bully's tactics. But beneath that, it was a powerful definition that invited comparison. It didn't just say you're wrong. It implicitly asked the audience, which of these two models in front of you fits this definition? It shifted the audience from passive spectators to active jurors. The language was also perfectly balanced, diminish against elevate, two verbs that are clear opposites, creating a satisfying, complete thought. There was no jargon, no complexity, just crystalline clarity. This is why it could be understood by a teenager and yet quoted by a philosophy professor. Its simplicity was its genius, making it the perfect vessel for a monumental idea. The aftermath rippled far beyond politics. Corporate trainers began using the clip in seminars on executive presence and conflict resolution. Teachers showed it in classrooms to discuss civil discourse. It entered the cultural lexicon. The phrase, the capacity to elevate, started appearing in mission statements, in wedding vows, in graduation speeches. It became a shorthand for a certain kind of maturity, a North Star for conduct in an increasingly divisive world. The former leader, perhaps without even intending to, had given people a new tool, a linguistic shield and a standard to aspire to. This is the ultimate victory for an idea, when it escapes its original context and begins to live a life of its own in the minds of millions. We also have to consider the role of time in this encounter. The president's attack was of the moment, raw, reactive, designed for the immediate headline. It was a tweet given breath. The response was timeless. It drew from a deep well of classical thought, from concepts of servant leadership and stoic virtue that have been discussed for millennia. It connected a petty, contemporary squabble to the eternal human quest for good governance. This is why the insult feels dated when you watch it now, while the reply feels as fresh and relevant as ever. One was a spark, the other was a lighthouse. Sparks fade. Lighthouses endure. The event also exposed the changing appetite of the public. For years, the loudest, most outrageous voice had commanded the airwaves. It was assumed that chaos and conflict were the only engines of engagement. This moment challenged that dogma. It proved there is a massive, underserved audience starving for substance, for nuance, for grace under pressure. The millions of shares and views were a market signal. They showed that people are exhausted by the endless noise and are deeply responsive to signals of clarity and composure. In an economy of attention where everyone is shouting, the person who speaks calmly and wisely suddenly owns the most valuable currency of all, trust. Finally, let's reflect on the personal discipline this required. The calm we witnessed wasn't accidental. It was the product of a lifetime of practice. It was the muscle memory of a mind trained to process stimulus not through the amygdala, the brain's threat center, but through the prefrontal cortex, its reasoning center. In that crucial moment between insult and response, 1,000 neural pathways fired. The easier path, the human path, was to retaliate, to defend, to match heat with heat. He chose the harder path, to metabolize the aggression, filter out the venom, and respond not to the emotion, but to the underlying fallacy. This is the superpower of emotional intelligence, not the absence of feeling, but the mastery of it. He didn't suppress his anger. He transmuted it into fuel for a higher purpose. So what's the lasting lesson for us? It's not about politics. It's about the geometry of human interaction. When you're met with a force coming directly at you, the instinct is to meet it head on. But that's how energy cancels out, how conversations become battles with no real victor. The advanced move is to step slightly to the side, to redirect that incoming force, to use its own momentum to propel it into empty space. The aggressor, expecting resistance, stumbles forward into nothingness. That's the jujitsu. That's the art. It requires patience, confidence, and a profound understanding that the true goal isn't to win the point, it's to win the room. And ultimately, to win the story. The moment crystallized into legend, not in the room, but in the hours after, as clips of that one line spread across the world. It was a masterclass in rhetorical jujitsu, using an opponent's force against them. It proved that the most powerful weapon in a room full of shouting is often a single, perfectly calibrated truth, delivered not with fury, but with fathomless calm. It reminded us that history's loudest voices often fade to echoes, while its quietest truths resonate for generations. And if you believe in the power of words spoken with integrity, let Winds of Thought know by liking this video. We unfold the moments where philosophy meets real life.